Good afternoon and welcome to the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario's second of two webinars on our 2016 Greenhouse Gas Progress Report. My name is Nancy Pilardi and I am the Climate Change Manager here at the ECO. As many of you are no doubt aware, the Environmental Commissioner is Ontario's environmental watchdog. A key responsibility of our office is to monitor and report on progress made toward reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the province. Commissioner Diane Sachs, who was appointed to the role of Commissioner in December 2015, will be speaking shortly. This webinar is based on our Greenhouse Gas Progress Report called Facing Climate Change, which was released and tabled to the Ontario Legislature in November 2016. Since the report's released, we have received significant feedback on its usefulness to individuals and groups who are seeking to understand and engage more fully in the climate conversation. The full report and executive summary can be downloaded from our website. The report contains 7 chapters and covers a wide range of issues. For this reason, we have chosen to present the report in 2 separate webinars. During our first webinar on February 8th, the Commissioner presented the highlights from the first part of the report and reviewed the science as well as Ontario's current emission levels. Today's webinar will focus more specifically on climate policies that the provincial government put in place in 2016. Commissioner Sachs will review the ECO's analysis of the cap and trade program, discuss how revenues from the sale of allowances should be spent, and highlight some aspects of the government's climate change action plan. She will also conclude by offering some words of hope. For those of you who want to learn more about Ontario's cap and trade program, our office has published a document that explains the structure and the mechanics of the program. You can find it on our website as Appendix A to the report. Before we hear from Commissioner Sachs, a few technical details. We expect that the presentation will take about 40 minutes. You are invited to submit questions at any time using the question and answer pane on the GoToWebinar window. Please do not use the raise your hand feature. You can expand or contract your control panel using the orange button. We will hold questions until after the Commissioner's presentation and try to respond to as many as possible in the time available. The webinar will also be recorded and will be available for viewing on our website in the next few days. Our website is www.eco.on.ca. A follow-up email, including today's slides and a link to the recording, will also be sent to all webinar registrants. With that taken care of, I would now like to introduce Commissioner Diane Sachs to present some of the highlights from our last 4 chapters of our report. Welcome, Commissioner.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. For those who didn't yet have an opportunity to see the first webinar, if you want, it's available on YouTube. We've had a very good response to it there, and I'll be picking up at Chapter 4. So we basically took away that our bottom line on the cap and trade system is we think it's been designed fairly well for Ontario. Of course, there's lots of details, and there are a lot of things that can go wrong. But we have to start here. Ontario is doing so much right on climate change after, admittedly, getting a fairly late start. Closing the coal power plants was huge, both for our greenhouse gas emissions and for air quality in Ontario. And as I hope you all know, the last coal plant in Ontario closed in April of 2014. The cap and trade system, which began to operate January 1st of 2017, we're now in the first compliance period, which is 2017 to 2020 under the Climate Change Mitigation and Low Carbon Economy Act of 2016, which is what I'm going to be talking about in a moment. An enormous step to finally get a price on carbon in Ontario. The action plan, which was released last June, setting out some of what the province plans to do with the money it intends to earn. And also it's important to recognize that we have to equally get ready for adaptation, and the province has committed itself to issue a release of Climate Ready 2011 climate adaptation plan. And we're already seeing a lot of preparatory documents coming out. Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources put out a very resilience document. Ministry of Health put out a document on the impact of climate change on health in Ontario. We saw the Lake Simcoe adaptation plan finally adopted just a couple of weeks ago. So good to see some action finally happening on adaptation in Ontario. But our report is mostly about mitigation, primarily cap and trade. Here's the link, again, if you want to go see the primer on cap and trade. These are the key issues that we looked at. First of all, what the targets are under what I'm calling the New Climate Act, some basics on cap and trade, some of the key design choices that Ontario made, some big issues relating to linking, particularly with California, and some takeaways for people in Ontario. And we have to start with the Climate Act. The critical feature of this act is finally putting into law the greenhouse gas reduction targets that Ontario adopted in 2007, but which are now part of our legal structure. And as you can see from this drawing, we're talking about a very ambitious transformation of our energy economy. 70% of the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in Ontario come directly from the energy supply and consumption, governed by the Long-Term Energy Plan. And I hope that those of you who are interested in that have seen our special report on the Long-Term Energy Plan. And what we're looking at is a 15% reduction below 1990 levels by 2020, which is basically tomorrow, 35% by 2035, and 37% by 2035, and 80% by 2050. 2050 does seem like a long way away, but those years goes very fast. And again, to have an 80% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, we've got to get running now. There's nothing going to be easy about this transformation. Now, the basic theory about putting a price on carbon is really economics 101. If we want to reduce pollution, it has to have a cost to the person who's releasing the pollution. The principle of polluter pays has been accepted as a foundational principle of environmental law all around the world, but in Ontario, we've never applied it to greenhouse gas emissions, despite the enormous harm they are causing, as we showed last time. So that's the basic idea. Polluters would pay less if there was a cost to it for them. Now, there are two basic flavors for how to put a price on carbon, lots of details. But here are the two basic flavors. They're called generally carbon tax, which of course has the word tax in it, and cap and trade. In general, in carbon tax, the government puts a price. They put a fixed level of tax on usually each ton of greenhouse gas emissions. This is pretty simple to understand. Everybody has a general sense of what taxes are. You can tell how much you have to pay. It's faster to write. It's faster to implement. It's cheap to implement. Lots of good things about tax in terms of simplicity. However, one of the objectives of putting a price on carbon is not only to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also to keep the economic cost to a minimum. And a carbon tax doesn't do that. It's cheaper to operate the system, but a cap and trade system allows more of the reductions to be made in the parts of the economy where they can be done more cheaply, and that can allow, over time, a given level of emission reductions to occur at less economic cost. Now, in addition to that fundamental question, whether the government sets the price or the government sets a cap on emissions, there's also an equally fundamental question as to what is the government going to do with the money. One of the basic theories is called sometimes cap and dividend, and this is more like what British Columbia is doing, where they take the money in from putting a price on carbon and they give it all back to the population. The government doesn't keep any. The alternative is a cap and invest approach, which is where the government does keep the money and then uses it, and then there's a lot of different things they can use it for. And Ontario chose a cap and trade system with a cap and invest approach. That is, the government is going to keep the money and they're required by law to use it to result in additional GHG reduction. So that's the fundamental design choices that went into Ontario's system. So we start with a cap. What are they capping? The idea here is very much like an income tax return. At the end of the year, we all have to file an income tax return saying, we made this much money, we owe this much tax. Same kind of thing for greenhouse gas emissions. The capped emitters covered by the system will have to file a report to the government As I already indicated, the first compliance period will be over 4 years. So at the end of, in 2021, each capped emitter is going to have to file a report with the government that says, in the last 4 years, we emitted so many tons of greenhouse gases. And then they have to pay for those emissions by providing the government an equal match of permits to pollute. The way the system is supposed to ratchet down greenhouse gas pollution is there is only a limited supply of those allowances that the government can issue. Economic theory again, as the supply goes down, the price should go up. As the price should go up, emitters should have a larger and larger financial incentive to do whatever they need to do to reduce their emissions. The allowance cap is set in the Ontario regulation. It's section 54, and there is a certain number of allowances that the government may give away or sell each year, 2017 to 2018. Now, the critical assumption to this, as I said, is that as the supply of allowances goes down, the price should go up. This clearly doesn't always work. This is a picture of the California carbon allowance futures, and as some of you probably know, although California's last auction back in November went quite well, the auction results were released yesterday were quite poor. Most of the allowances didn't sell at all. There's a floor price in the California system, most of them simply didn't sell. So there is a lot of uncertainty in a cap and trade system. Markets don't always work the way one hopes they would, and certainly yesterday's results are an object lesson of that. Now the cap is intended to provide the environmental part of cap and trade. It's the cap which is intended to limit the maximum amount of greenhouse gases emitted in the province over a period of time. But since we also have an economic objective, which I mentioned earlier, which is to keep the economic cost of emission reductions to a minimum, the trade part is the tool to achieve that. So it depends, first of all, on the nature of our economy. In economies where everybody has about the same cost to reduce emissions, trades don't get you much. But the Ontario economy is very, very diverse, and different actors have very different costs for reducing their emissions. And that gives the opportunity for a trade system to work. So what you see here is a situation where emitter A may have a fairly low cost to reduce its emissions, and emitter B may have a high cost. So they may want to purchase. Sorry, I got it the other way. So, no, that's right. A in this picture can pay B to reduce, because if B can reduce more cheaply than A can, then the total cost of reducing the emissions over the two companies would be lower than if each one has to do it themselves. So that's a pure market system. It's not controlled by the government. Private parties can buy and sell as they wish. They're not governed by the floor price in the official auctions, and they can basically make their own terms. And so the result in economic theory is that you should have, in total, a lower economic cost for greenhouse gas reductions than you would with a carbon tax. Now, there's a lot of different issues when it comes to designing a cap and trade system. Ontario has one big advantage by being fairly late to the cap and trade party, which is that we can learn from other jurisdictions. So the World Bank put out an excellent paper last year on critical design issues for a good and workable cap and trade system, and these are some of the key issues that they identified. And we reviewed each of these in our report and came to the conclusion that on the whole, Ontario had done a reasonable job in looking at the choices available. When we evaluated the design of the cap and trade system, these are the four most important things that we looked at. The first for us, and absolutely number one, is will it produce greenhouse gas emission reductions? If we aren't going to produce greenhouse gas emission reductions, then we're not getting where we need to go. The second thing, as I said earlier, is cost effectiveness. We do want to reduce emissions, but we want to do it at the lowest practical cost. The third thing is, how does the market work? Is it going to be fair? Is it going to allow some players to benefit, unfairly take advantage of others? Is the market going to work the way it's intended to? Because if it doesn't, you don't get the cost effectiveness benefits. And the fourth piece is carbon leakage. Now this is, again, a very critical question for Ontario, which has an extremely open economy. Our economy is even more integrated with our neighbors than, for example, California and Quebec, at least on some measures. So we want to have emissions reduced, but we don't want to drive businesses out of Ontario just to have them emit even more in some other jurisdiction. Classic example British Columbia had was they put on their carbon tax. They didn't provide effectively for carbon leakage. They drove about 40% of their cement manufacture outside the province, but then had to import cement which was made using coal, so a higher carbon footprint than the cement manufacturing in British Columbia that was displaced. We don't want to have that. Another example is chemical plants. So we have in Ontario some chemical plants that have quite low carbon footprints because they're using natural gas feedstock and they're using very low emission electricity, which we have in Ontario. If we drove those plants to Pennsylvania or Ohio, where a lot of the electricity comes from coal and the feedstock is oil, or we drive them to China, where the electricity comes from coal and the feedstock is coal, then we have hurt our own economy and employment quite a bit, and we have produced climate disadvantages, not advantages. So the question as to how to treat companies that are very trade exposed is important, and we capture that under the heading of carbon leakage. So when we look at the question as to who needs allowances, the Ontario economy, 2014, we had approximately 171 megatons. The cap and trade system does not cover the whole economy. So as you'll see on the right-hand side here, there's about 31 megatons of greenhouse gas emissions in Ontario in 2014 that are not covered by the cap and trade system. They don't need allowances, and that's primarily agriculture and waste, not their fossil fuel consumption, but their other emissions, nitrous oxides from fertilizer, methane from landfills and sewage plants and animals, other kinds of emissions. So we're going to leave those aside for a moment. They're important. We'll come back to them. That leaves about 140 megatons. Roughly 40 megatons come from approximately 100 of what we call large final emitters. These are individual facilities in Ontario that each year emits more than 25,000 tons of greenhouse gases. Some of those are very large institutions. Most of them are large industries. Now this group, which are generally called the large final emitters, each of them is required to have their own allowances and to file their own reports. So they are making their own decisions on how they're going to choose a balance between what they're going to buy and what they're going to reduce. And they are accountable individually for their results over the next 4 years. The other 100 megatons comes from all the rest of us. Every single Ontarian who uses any fossil fuel is contributing to that 100 megatons. For natural gas for heating our houses, diesel or gasoline for transportation, any other fossil fuel that we use. But it's not practical or reasonable for every single one of the 13 million of us to be participating in the carbon market, buying allowances, and so on and so forth. So we don't. Our liquid fuel and natural gas distributors have to acquire allowances, and they're going to pass the cost on to us. In the case of the natural gas distributors, the Ontario Energy Board regulates how they pass the cost on. In case of the liquid fuel distributors, which is basically people selling gasoline and diesel, it's just going to go in the price. Now, what I described a moment ago was who needs allowances. But primarily because of the issue of carbon leakage, not everyone who needs allowances has to pay for it. And the main difference, as you can see in the middle, is for those large final emitters. The liquid fuel and natural gas distributors, they want allowances, they have to pay for them. They can buy them by auction from the government, and the first auction will take place later this month. The results will be available early in April. or they can buy allowances in the secondary market. They may also be able to buy offsets, which I'll come back to, but they have to pay for their allowances. The large final emitters will get most of their allowances free until 2020. Now, the number that they will get free will reduce each year to give them some incentive to continue to reduce their emissions. But for the carbon leakage reasons primarily, they're going to get most of them for free from the government. When we evaluate all the design choices together, this is basically was our takeaway, that for the Ontario economy, cap and trade is reasonable, it's appropriate for the nature of our economy, but it definitely has challenges. The first and biggest challenge is it's complicated. It's hard for people to understand. It will take time to work, which is another thing, particularly when you're looking at the large final emitters who have to make big decisions on their physical plant, but even for individuals. Cars don't turn over that often in Ontario. The average car has a working life of maybe 15 years. People have to make decisions on what their next car is, and they don't do that every year or every 5 years. So it takes time for people to make decisions to reduce their physical assets in ways that will reduce emissions, and that means you need longer-term certainty. You need to have some sense that the system is going to continue, and hopefully some sense is what the price is going to be in order to make good decisions. And those things can be challenging to achieve. Now, another critical issue that Ontario chose to do was not to go it alone. Ontario has committed through the Western Climate Initiative to link our system next year with California and Quebec. And the critical reason for this is it makes it cheaper. Remember, 100 megatons of the emissions come from all of us. And the ministry commissioned a study which said, in essence, that the cost for each family would be more than quadruple if Ontario was trying to do it alone. And partly that's because we've already done some of the cheaper emission reductions, such as closing our coal plants. So many of the options that are left now are more expensive. Linking with California, where they have a lower level of greenhouse gases per GDP, and they've also gone a long way down reducing emissions from transportation, and they have some extra allowances, as we can see in their auction system, will keep the cost of allowances quite a bit lower for Ontario emitters for the next few years at least. That may cross over 2021, 2022, but at least for the first 2 years, it means a less expensive on-ramp and easier adjustment for Ontario emitters. There are, of course, disadvantages. We wouldn't, if we locked in reliance on imported allowances, then we're going to be worse off as time goes on, because every year we're going to need to buy more and more foreign allowances, and we have to expect over time the California allowances will become more expensive as long as they're able to continue their system. And we also don't get the money going into the greenhouse gas reduction account, which the province is counting on, and we don't get the pollution reductions and the innovation, the kind of things we want to be the co-benefits of reducing emissions. And we also have a temporary problem of an outflow of cash to California, although as you see in our report, we think that even if there is a temporary outflow of cash to California, it is likely to be more than offset by a reduction in what we spend to buy fossil fuels each year. Ontario spends more than $11 billion a year importing fossil fuels, and all of that money drains out of the economy without doing any good and never comes back. So any reduction in our fossil fuel dependence can leave more money in the economy, which can do a lot of good. There are challenges, however, about California. They have significant legal challenges for the continuation of their program. One is a litigation that's going on now about their current cap-and-trade system, and secondly, there's a question as to whether they will be able to successfully reauthorize after 2020 due to a constitutional amendment called Proposition 26. There are ways that California may be able to resolve each of these. Governor Brown now has, or at least the Democratic Party has a supermajority in both the House and Senate in California since the November election. That theoretically may allow them to get a supermajority to extend cap and trade, and that will dispose of their legal problems. But at the moment, there's a period of uncertainty, and that period of uncertainty could well last for a year or more as the litigation goes through the courts and until they are able to get the clarity as to the legal situation of the reauthorization. But then again, I have to admit, when they look at us, they have to say, but can we count on Ontario, given that we have an election next year and the Conservatives promising not to have cap and trade? So there's uncertainty on both sides. Now, as an alternative to buying allowances from California, there's another very important opportunity which can keep the emission reductions and the money in Ontario. And this is offsets. So under the Western Climate Initiative structure, up to 8% of the allowances that emitters need can be compliance offsets. Ontario has committed itself to adopting 13 of the offset protocols that are now in use in California and Quebec. The first 3 are the ones in red: mine, methane, landfill gas, and ozone-depleting substances, most of those refrigerants. The province has indicated that we will see protocols for those 3 soon, whatever soon means, and the rest of the list of 13 either later this year or in 2018. And if they are cost competitive, they can do a lot to keep innovation and emission reductions and money in Ontario. We think that's very important, and we're keeping a close eye on it. Of course, the offsets have to be high quality. We don't want them to be greenwashing. So put it all together, what does it mean for the average household if you do nothing to reduce your emissions? And most people have many opportunities to reduce their emissions. But if you do nothing to reduce your emissions, as you can see, the cost for an average family is quite modest. This is a direct political choice. We know that at rates this low, you don't get very much behavior change. And so government's own predictions are that cap and trade at the kinds of prices we're likely to have in the next few years is only going to produce about 10% of the reductions that we need. But any price on carbon is better than no price on carbon, and at least it is a start. It does give people a signal that greenhouse gas pollution isn't free, and it's a step in the right direction. So I'm going to try to go more quickly through the next 2 chapters. The critical issue about the greenhouse gas reduction account from where we sit is to make sure that the government actually spends the money on initiatives to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There is, of course, an enormous temptation in any government that once there is a pile of money, everybody's got really good ideas as to how to spend it and lots of good reasons why it ought to be spent on whatever their issue is. Our view is that under the Act, this money cannot be used for good causes, no matter how worthy, unless they contribute to, in a significant way, additional greenhouse gas reductions that would not occur under business as usual and would not occur just because of cap and trade. This has to produce something on top of that, and there has to have a significant connection. Again, we're very interested in checking to make sure that the proper methodology is used and that there is a good case for how the money is to be used. Now, the province has indicated in its action plan lots and lots of things they want to do with the money that they hope to get from the auction, and if they don't get the money, they won't be able to implement the action plan. Clearly, there is a risk that they won't get all the money they had hoped for, and the relatively poor results in the California auction yesterday is a very good example of that. One of the things we've noted in our report is that the province hasn't said what they'll do if there's a shortfall. They have set out no principles for prioritizing all the various goodies that they hope to have. And there are very difficult choices that have to be made, for example, between short-term and small decreases and longer-term bigger increases. There's also real questions about equity. How much do you do to try to help the poor if it's not as cost-effective as doing something else? So there's very difficult trade-offs to be made, and we think it's important that the government be explicit and transparent as to how they're making those trade-offs. Then there's the action plan itself. Now, calling it an action plan is a little bit ambitious. Certainly, if I put together a plan, I'd expect it to actually have numbers that add up and clear actions to be taken, and frankly, we don't see that in the action plan. It's more of an aspirational document than an actual plan that you could go out and implement, and a lot of the numbers don't add up. Still, I recognize that the ministry has had a huge job to try to move into this new world in a fairly short period of time, and they have to negotiate with other ministries right across the government. One of the goals of the Environmental Bill of Rights was to make it clear that environmental issues weren't just the responsibility of the Ministry of Energy, or Environment, that they were also the responsibility of other ministries, and cap and trade is certainly making that clear. Lots of ministries have to think about climate in ways they never did before. But that also makes the negotiations more difficult. Now, there are many good ideas in the action plan, and from what we can see, most of the good ideas will take time. That is, they're not going to produce a lot of reductions by 2020, but they should do quite a lot moving forward, again, assuming that the system lasts long enough. Three of the ones that we picked out as being particularly valuable is funding more transit and a better integration of transit with land use. The Green Bank, which they're now calling the Ontario Climate Change Solutions Deployment Corporation, I mean, it rolls off the tongue, which is going to provide funding for energy efficiency improvements primarily in housing, and supporting clean tech companies through what they call the Valley of Death, which is a financing gap that frequently destroys Ontario innovations once they leave the research stage and try to become commercial. We've had for many years not enough capital to help companies through that intermediate stage, and it seems to us that it's a reasonable use of the cap and trade money to make some bets like that, even though we know that not every company that's supported in this way will succeed. However, we couldn't be as optimistic about the claims that the action plan makes for 2020, because they make big claims that they're going to get 9.8 megatons of reductions by 2020, and frankly, we don't believe it. We looked most closely at the three biggest claims, and for two of them, there was simply no credible support. The renewable fuel regulation, which the governor is predicting would produce 2 megatons in reductions. The interesting thing about that is that's primarily a regulatory change. It's not primarily a question of use of the cap and trade revenues. And we think it could actually produce significant reductions in the 1 to 2 megaton range, of still a pretty small proportion of what we need, although probably a fairly high cost. It's at still a fairly early stage in innovation. So what we see is there is going to be in 2020 a pretty big gap between what the cap and trade system is predicted to produce, what the action plan is likely to produce, and the 2020 target. So early reduction credits will probably feel a little bit about that, although the province has said it's going to be releasing a fairly small number of early reduction credits. So what that leaves is really only three possibilities. Either there will be more reductions in Ontario than companies predicted when they were surveyed last year, despite the relatively low cost of allowances, or we'll see reductions from offsets, or we'll see Ontario emitters buying California allowances. Those are the only three options for reaching the 2020 target, and at this point we can't predict how those are going to be divided up. The offsets, as I said earlier, we think are a really important opportunity. We think, for example, about urban forestry, something that is incredibly important both for mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, but even more importantly for adaptation, for preparing for what's coming, for keeping cities cooler, for making them easier to live in as the urban heat island effect and the climate change build on each other. There's been no money for this. Offsets could provide a new financial stream for something we really need, but the province has got to get its rules together. They've got to be good rules, and people have to take them up. So after the action plan, there's lots to do. This is something that is going to call on everyone's creativity and opportunities. It's not something we can leave just to the government. And we hope that each of you will play a role. So we know that lots of people do want to play a role. We see lots of room for optimism internationally, as long as you don't spend too much time looking south. The Paris Agreement, enormously important, fastest international environmental agreement ever to come into force, and the first time that the whole world agreed that everybody would do something to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. No, it's not enough, but it's still a huge step in the right direction. The Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol agreeing to reduce the explosive growth in hydrofluorocarbons, a refrigerant with a very high global warming potential. Anybody out there who's using refrigerants in your operations, you've got a big opportunity there to have a significant impact by going to refrigerants with lower greenhouse gas impacts, such as, for example, carbon dioxide, amazingly enough, is a refrigerant with a much lower global warming potential. The carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation, yes, it's a pretty small step, but again, it's the first time they're doing anything significant. Pan-Canadian framework to have a price on carbon right across the Canadian economy. These are all important. We're glad to see them. We do think there's a lot more that the government can and should do to earn Ontarian support on climate change. One of the biggest reasons is actions speak louder than words. I'm going everywhere showing people the facts about how dire climate change is, but the government isn't really acting that way. Most Ontario government and federal government decisions, even municipal government decisions, are still being made the way they always were. And until that changes, why would people think that really they have to act as well? So we see lots of examples across the government of activities, actions by the government that are inconsistent with their climate targets. As I already mentioned, the long-term energy plan report, certainly encourage you to take a look at that. The road toll ban, again, a particularly egregious example of the province getting in the way of doing something about transportation, our fastest growing source of emissions, and 2/3 of what we spend on importing fossil fuels goes for gasoline and diesel. So lots of examples of the province continuing to do things wrong, which, if they don't fix these, we are not going to get anywhere near our climate targets, and we're not going to have the greener economy, more sustainable cities that many people want. On the other hand, there are lots of good examples. I already mentioned some of these that are coming across both municipally and provincially and federally. Ministry of Health's report on climate risk. I certainly recommend that you read that. So lots of people doing good things. And here's one that I was really pleased with, to see workers crying out for an opportunity to be retrained and to work in the renewable economy that they like to do. So when we come down to it, climate can't be left entirely up to government. So the three things that I suggest everyone can do and should do, both personally and in your organizations. Number one, figure out your carbon footprint and then do something to reduce it. For myself, when I added mine up, what I realized my biggest remaining impact was heating my house. So I've switched to using landfill gas for my house, and now I don't have to feel guilty about that. And if it's possible, tell people about it, because it's really important that people see other people doing things. Most people think no one's doing anything. The second is get ready to adapt to what's coming. We've got big changes coming into Ontario. We're already feeling them. You don't want to be yourself or your home or your family one of the ones badly damaged because you didn't prepare. But the most important thing you can do is speak up. Political representatives at every level of government are exquisitely sensitive to what they hear from their constituents, particularly when they hear it in person. If all they hear about is electricity prices, they're going to make one kind of public policy decision. If what they hear about from their constituents is concern about climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, and good questions about what they're doing, you will get a different political response. I cannot overestimate how important it is to speak to your political representatives and encourage others to do so. It's too late to have no climate change, but it's not too late to make a difference. So thank you very much, and we'll now take questions.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner. And so we've had a few questions come in, and one of the first ones that came through is with regard to the use of waste. And can you just provide some of your thoughts on the use of waste to produce energy or biogas using anaerobic digestion?
I think it's a tremendous opportunity that can allow us to solve a number of different problems at once. the natural gas infrastructure that we have across Ontario is very extensive. It's an enormous investment. We know we have to reduce our fossil fuel dependence, but there is no reason why a natural gas pipeline has to carry just fossil fuels. It can certainly carry methane, biogas, and in fact some other gases as well that can be produced in part from waste. At the same time, we have an urgent need to reduce the amount of waste that we put into landfills, and on the third hand, it's really important that we stop the emission of methane from landfills and other organic wastes. So for all of those reasons, it makes tremendous sense to, instead of throwing out organics, to use them, digest them, compost them, collect the methane, use that as fuel. Now, I recognize that the technology is still developing, but there are many places in Europe, as well as in Ontario, where biogas is being created, and I'd love to see a big upsurge of that industry.
Great. Well, you touched on the topic of new technologies, which leads me into the next question, which asks you to look into your crystal ball. Do you think that the development of new technologies to reduce carbon emissions will significantly reduce the price of allowances?
Well, if that happens, then the design and the price adjustment system won't work very well. One of the features of our cap and trade system is what they call a price collar. There is a price floor for the official allowances, and there is essentially a price cap because a certain percentage of the allowances go into reserve that will be sold at a fixed price. The expectation is that the province will continue to adjust the number of allowances downward so that there isn't a huge surplus, so that the price will go up. I certainly hope that we will see explosive growth in new technologies that will make it less and less expensive to have good lives with lower greenhouse gas emissions. And we have seen an extraordinary crash in the price of, for example, solar and wind over the last 15 years. If you go back to 2000 and look at the predictions for how much a role solar and wind could play by now, well, we've beaten those 16 times, 17 times. Biggest single reason is that China has driven the cost of solar and wind technology down at an extraordinary pace. So I certainly hope we see lots more of that.
And just to follow on the heels of your comments about solar, a question has just come through that asks, is there support for thermal solar that is being considered? Solar thermal to provide both domestic and commercial hot water, as well as to supplement space heating. If you again, put your crystal ball on and...
So when we talk about support, remember that the cap and trade system is designed to produce both a pull and a push. So because there is admittedly a small price on carbon, there is an economic incentive for people to find ways to reduce their reliance on fossil fuels. And thermal solar is one of the options for reducing your reliance on fossil fuels. So people may decide to look harder at thermal solar because they don't want to spend as much on fossil fuels. It could also be that we will see some of the money from the action plan spent on supporting technology development in that area. Nothing in the action plan tells us which technologies will be selected, and I don't know which ones they're going to be. And my concern will be to make sure that there is an appropriate methodology to ensure that the money will produce meaningful greenhouse gas reductions. The third possibility is, will there be some kind of offset system that this might fit into, which again might lead to a flow of funds that would encourage the introduction of solar. And there's two things about offsets that I didn't say earlier. I talked about compliance offsets that can be used to basically fill out that income tax return at the end of the compliance period. But the Ontario government is also talking about a voluntary offset system because the government has committed itself to becoming carbon neutral. And since they won't be able to stop heating all their buildings right away, they will be needing to buy offsets basically to offset their own emissions. And those will not be compliance offsets and could be more flexible. So there's a number of different ways that money could flow into new technology. It'll be very exciting to watch how it works.
And watching how things play out feeds into the next question that asks, to what extent are the cap and trade program and the climate change action plan at risk of being gutted or revoked if there is a change in government in 2018?
Well, it's certainly possible. We have a parliamentary system of government, and the government of the day can pass any laws that the legislature will pass. The cap and trade system is not a constitutionally entrenched system, it's simply a law. So any future government could change that law or revoke it or replace it with something else.
So one question that has come in around who's involved in the cap and trade program. And this one asks, how do you think the government can get the other big polluters into the cap and trade program, knowing that with the present plan, the public is crying and paying more at the pump?
I think, with all due respect, this question reflects a misunderstanding of what's going on. As I think we showed already, the impact on prices at the pump is quite modest, much smaller than the fluctuations in the price of gasoline that go up and down with the price of oil on a regular basis. And all the major sources in Ontario that use fossil fuels are included in the system. As I showed, there's 31 megatons of emissions, primarily from agriculture and waste, that are not yet covered, and the hope is that the offset system will bring them into a program of emission reductions. If the question there was about whether I think more costs should be imposed on the 100 large final emitters, I think I already explained why our evaluation is that the government made a reasonable decision in providing the large final emitters with a declining but large percentage of their emissions for free in a short period of time. So I don't know of any large emitters that are completely exempt, other than we do feel that methane is not adequately dealt with in the current system, and we've explained why in Chapter 3 of the report.
And now you need to put on your flashlight to look into the California market. Can you give any opinions as to why the market price for carbon is so low in California, the auction prices that have just come through? And is it because Californians are reducing greenhouse gas emissions towards a reducing emissions cap?
I mean, that's a very good question. The first thing that's important to recognize about California, their allowance prices are at their floor, right? So their system is designed to have a floor price, and they're selling them at their floor. The question really is, I think, why are there more allowances than the market participants need in California? And there are at least two reasons that I know about. The first is that California decided what number of allowances each year to sell back in 2012. So they took an 8-year period to go back to their 1990 emissions. So quite a slow level of decrease over a long period of time. And in some respects, it turned out, as happens in other cap and trade systems, that people could reduce a little less expensively, partly because the cost of technology improved. A second reason is that many of the emission sources in California are not actually in their cap and trade system. So they have a renewable fuel standard, they have a power standard, which has taken basically vehicles and electricity out of their cap and trade system and into separate regulatory systems. So in the renewable fuel standard area, for example, the price for carbon credits is very high. It's about $100 a ton, much higher than the price in the general market because they've been walled off in a special area. And a third reason is that there had been some expectation earlier on that the U.S. would have a national clean power plan and that California allowances would be usable in other states. Given the current administration, that doesn't seem likely.
Great. So this is asking about heat and where we are going to have our heat coming from in the future. Many countries and international organizations predict buildings will be heated and cooled by heat pumps in 2050. Why are heat pumps not part of the climate solution in Ontario?
Heat pumps are an obvious part of the solution for sure, and I use a heat pump in my own house. And one of the things that we do see in the action plan is encouragement for fuel switching, and then one of the ways to fuel switch is to go from natural gas heating of houses or buildings to, for example, heat pumps. The question, I think, is not whether one particular technology will do the job, but how do we get multiple different factors working together? And it seems to me that Sweden is a great example for us to look at, because Sweden managed to reduce their energy consumption in buildings by about 86% over the last generation, and Ontario emission reductions have been quite small. Sweden did it by a lot of different factors together. One is that they moved pretty heavily to much more energy efficient buildings much earlier than we did. Second thing they did was they moved heavily to district heating and cooling so that individual buildings don't have their own individual combustion equipment. They then looked at making those district heating systems, move them off fossil fuels onto, for example, waste. And now they're paying a lot of attention to the embedded energy in the buildings themselves. So they have they found that looking at particular pieces of technology by themselves wasn't the answer. You need more of a systems approach, and I suspect we need that here as well.
Now, you touched on the different approaches to putting a price on carbon. This one is asking, given that cap and trade is complicated and conducive to abuse, and given that the province hasn't yet set clear priorities on how to use the income from the sale of allowances, why didn't Ontario choose a simpler, more equitable system such as a carbon fee and dividend plan?
Well, I certainly agree that a carbon fee and dividend plan is simpler. And it can be designed to be more equitable, although it isn't necessarily so. First of all, I have to remind everybody I'm not the government. I don't speak for the government, and I cannot tell you why the government made one decision or another. But as I indicated earlier, the fundamental analysis in Ontario was that a low carbon price, such as the price that people are now paying for, doesn't produce very much in terms of reductions. It only gets, as predicted, 2.8 megatons in 2020. So if you accept that we need 24 megatons reductions in 2020, which we do once you take the strategic reserve into account, then a dividend, if the carbon price stayed as low as it is now, and you gave all the money back to people, then we wouldn't be anywhere near 24 megatons, we'd be at 2.8 megatons. So in order to have a carbon fee and dividend system and achieve our greenhouse gas targets, there would have to be a price of carbon that is many times higher than it is now. That's a political choice.
And if you were a politician, the next question is, if you were to choose how the GGRA, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Account, is spent, what would you do?
Well, first of all, we don't pretend to have all the answers, but I think it's really important to have an explicit policy. Other jurisdictions, California, for example, has a publicly determined ratio. They spend this much on in low-income and disadvantaged neighborhoods. They spend this much for low-income, disadvantaged neighborhoods. They spend this much on transit. And I think we should have a very public, transparent debate. How much do we spend on short-term? How much do we spend on long-term? How much do we spend on helping those adversely affected? How much do we spend on big bets, looking to have a moonshot? Because there isn't any really clear right answer. These are social choices. How are we going to together share the burdens and the benefits of this major transformation of our economy? I don't think any one person has a monopoly on what the right answer is.
Okay, and I think we're coming to the end of the questions. The one final question that I think we'll ask you is, how does the government plan to ensure, so this is getting into the nuts and bolts of the cap and trade program, and I would just remind people that we do have a primer online that explains a bit more about the cap and trade program. But this one is, how does the government plan to ensure that participants pay up for each compliance period? So that's speaking more to the mechanics.
Right. So this is something that the government is actually pretty good at. Our government has lots of experience collecting taxes, and this is just another variation on that. So there's only so many parties that have to participate in the market. It basically is roughly 150. So if you think about the income tax system where you have to check compliance by millions of people and millions of businesses, I think millions, anyway, lots of businesses, checking compliance by 150 organizations is comparatively easy. We know who they all are, or at least the government does. They all have been required to report for some time, so the government has records of their historic emissions. They are all going to be required to provide reports as to what their emissions are, and many of those reports are fairly easy to check. So the large final emitters, for example, the biggest part of their emissions come from the fuel they buy, and the fuel distributors will have to have reported how much they bought. So it's not as if you could sort of secretly buy an extra few tanker loads of oil. And then there are engineering estimates that allow a pretty good guess as to what the emissions would be from the fuel purchases that those companies will have had. Now, so that in terms of figuring out how much they owe shouldn't be tremendously difficult. In terms of making them pay it, now that is admittedly more interesting, but the government has thought that through after extensive consultation with, for example, the Securities Commission, which has lots of experience in enforcing securities law. The short answer is that at the end of the period, if people haven't submitted to the government the number of allowances that they have to do, the government can take them out of their allowance budget. Each company is required to have basically a bank account for their allowances, and if they haven't paid up, the minister can just take it. If they have short paid, not only can the government take everything they owe, they can also take 3 times more than that of the gap. So if they were 100 megatons short in not 100 megatons, but 10,000 tons short in paying, the government can take the 10,000 and then another 30,000 for a total of 40. And if they don't pay up in emissions, then they owe the amount in money that they would have paid to buy the allowances, and the government can seize that money in a number of different ways. So actually, I think the government's got quite a few tools for collecting that.
Okay, then. Thank you very much for all your questions. I think that wraps up the time that we have allocated for that. So this concludes our second webinar on our 2016 Greenhouse Gas Report. The full report, as well as the primer on cap and trade, as I mentioned, is currently made available on our website at eco.on.ca. Archives of the 2 webinars will also be made available shortly. And finally, if you wish to be advised of upcoming reports and events, please sign up for the eco updates through our website. You can see the information there on the screen. So once again, thank you for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.